Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time you are listening to us. We welcome you to another episode of Pages to Progress. Today, we are diving into the next few chapters of the book that we're currently dealing with. John seems to be my faithful guide to hold up the book. We're looking at Simply Jesus by N.T. Wright. You are very welcome to come and join with us on this journey. So far, quite a riveting read. It's definitely challenged us on a different number of different levels. If you look at the description on this YouTube link, you should be able to see where to find the book, and would love for you to be able to join us on that journey. Today, I'm joined with John, with Dee, with James, and with Matt, and we're grateful that we can have this discussion together. We're reflecting on chapters 6 and chapters 7. I think last episode we did 3 chapters and realized that we had bitten off more than we can chew to try and record in such a short space of time. So we've limited it to 2 chapters, 6 and 7. Not to say that there wasn't a lot of meat in these chapters, because it was pretty intense reading in terms of the weight. But I think N.T. Wright has some things that he wants to challenge us upon. Let's start with chapter 6, guys, shall we? Chapter 6, the title is God is in Charge. I felt like N.T. Wright was trying to really set the backdrop for the time in which Jesus was living. I think he well positions his words, not just for a Christian to read, but I think he well positions his words for even an atheist to read, to even just challenge them just for a moment, to put aside their preconditioned ideas of religion and whether Jesus, the historical Jesus, is a real thing or not. And he just, for the moment, just tries to invite people on the journey of, if Jesus did exist and he was real, what kind of world did he live in, and what kind of statements did he say, or what kind of life did he live within that current context? That's what I felt chapter 6 was predominantly about. Actually, I would even propose that he's doing that in chapter 7 as well, which we'll come to that as well. But the theme that he brings across, God is in charge, is a very prominent theme, where he wants us to try and understand that the statement of Jesus being King of the Jews per se, or being the one who is the rescuer, sits into the cultural reality that there are current kings available at that time, and those current kings who assert their authority over everything comes into direct conflict with this new king, supposedly Jesus. I'll leave it at that for now. I thought that it was a very interesting historical storytelling of how Jesus makes quite a large impact. I think that another thing that N.T. Wright makes quite a shift in this narrative, which we can talk a little bit later, is what goes on in the Jewish mind when they hear of the man named Jesus. We'll come to that in a second. For now, maybe I'll kick things off with a quote that I thought was interesting, and then we can open up the floor to your thoughts. I'd love to be able to hear what the rest of the panel think of as well. Page 59, kind of 2/3 of the way down, and this is the quote. God was already in charge, but she or he already also knew that with every bone and breath, that there were all sorts of ways in which God was not in charge. Otherwise, why was this world a mess? I think N.T. Wright really just brings out something that's not just locked in antiquity, but it's in the here and now. Everyone here, at least Christians for that matter, suppose that God is in charge of our lives. But there are so many aspects of our lives which seem to speak differently to that. We all have struggles and worries and concerns. We all know someone who is going through pain and turmoil. And to speak God is in charge in those moments is quite a challenging statement. And I think one of the things N.T. Wright really does, he actually tries to highlight that some of the ways in which we recognize God may not be as in charge as much as we would like him to be, is evidence of the fact that God will be in charge of those things one day. That I found quite a challenging way and perspective to view things. I see that very present in my life, that God is not yet in charge on some things, but will be in charge one day. Let me stop talking from there. I've offered some of my thoughts. What do you guys think? Were there some things that really pointed out to you that were worth sharing? Who'd like to go
So
for
I'm
it?
just going to jump in because I totally took this differently than you did.
Oh,
Um, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I took this as God is in charge and Jesus is what it looks like, but it's not exactly what we expect. And so we don't always see it the way we should.
mm-hmm.
And that's what was so astonishing to the Jews. And I think that's continued, and that could potentially be astonishing to us today. You know, we have expectations, but whether it turns out that way, you know, it may not be the way God sees it or wants to show us. Am I totally off base with that or not?
No, that you're valid to even suggest that.
James is smiling.
Yeah, I think, you know, this discussion reminds me of my late aunt's favorite verse. It's in 2 Corinthians 4, where it says, don't look at the things that are seen, but at the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are temporary, but the things that are unseen are eternal. I think certainly for us in our lives, it's easy to get confused or lose sight of the proposal that God is in charge currently when there's chaos and, you know, shootings and tragedies all around us and death. I like how later at the end of that page, then he says that, you know, at least partly he was talking the whole time about God being in charge on a larger scale as well. I remember the last discussion we had, we were talking about how, you know, the great Roman Empire, they were all into retrospective glories, you know, recounting the glories of their Roman kingdom, and then the Jews recounting sort of a prospective eschatology, something to hope for in the future. And then I like how Matt coined, you know, like a present day eschatology. And so I think that's sort of the revolutionary idea here that Jesus is presenting, that here we are in the first century AD Jewish mentality where they're still looking and waiting for literally a physical reality of God's kingdom coming and conquering. And you know, they've been through hundreds of years of being subject to some other country or other empire, you know, ever since the Babylonian captivity. And so they're hoping in that, and yet here Jesus says the kingdom is within you. It's already here. It's here right now. And so that's such a revolutionary idea, even for me in present day, 21st century. I struggle with that reality, that could God's kingdom be now? I mean, is God really in charge now? And I think as we read these chapters, personally, I was extremely inspired and encouraged by the fact that, yes, it's true. That's exactly what Jesus is saying. Yeah, those are some of my initial thoughts.
I guess for me personally, I have never thought of God being in charge of the first century Jewish nation. I've never thought of it that way. And when Jesus came, I never thought of it that way as
Sorry, Dee, why?
I think I was so focused on just seeing Jesus as this personal God that I know in my mind that he came obviously to save the world, to save the humanity, but I just focused. It was just all about just personal thing. He came and, you know, he made these personal contacts, personal connections, personally heal people, and, you know, one by one. And it's not like everyone entire Jewish nation, and then later on the Gentile nations were cured or healed or whatever. So it was surprise for me. It's a news to me that he came to be now in charge of the world. I always thought of that as being way in the future, but at the same time, when James mentions about the kingdom of God is already here, for me, I take that again in a very personal level. Like I know that I have personally experienced kingdom of God in my own life, and thought, wow, is this what kingdom of God is like? I want to be there all the time, kind of thing. But I don't know. I really didn't think that Jews actually in that first century thought that God was in charge already. I don't think so. I didn't think that at all.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, I can argue it both ways, because you see, I'm not going to use the word first century because it was more than a century. I mean, there were a couple millennia before Jesus came along, and you have, in a lot of ways, a less personal God, in that you came to God through the high priest or the priest at the tabernacle, and then eventually the temple. And I think there was a radical shift when Jesus came and became that personal connection. And I see that as a result of sin, but I don't see it across the board necessarily, because Jesus certainly reached out to people. You see Noah, and you see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses, and then through the prophets, even while they had the priests and stuff. But there, I think I can see what Dia is saying, is that it's there is a difference between now and then. But at the same time, the Jews had this mentality that God came to them and was using them, that the Savior would come through them. And then somehow through that, and I'm not sure exactly why, but they kind of felt that they were the only chosen people instead of just chosen people. And I think that's something you got to be careful with, even as Seventh-day Adventists, certainly as Seventh-day Adventists, but even as Christians. I don't think we necessarily make that decision. That's a decision God makes, who's chosen and who's not.
I just to jump on top of that, I do think that the Jews misappropriated the message and made it about supremacy rather than appointment to do a job. And I think we sometimes fall into that. I think from listening to what you guys have said, I do realize to myself that what N.T. Wright was trying to support the notion that God was in charge, but if I'm being brutally honest with myself, there are many moments in my life where I feel like God isn't in charge. And I may talk myself out of it and say, oh, well, God knows what he's doing in some respects, but the feelings don't necessarily meet the reality. And I think that's essentially what the Jews were going through. I think when we go through their story and we recognize some of the challenges that they faced, on one hand, they had this very powerful message of a God who was faithful to them, who had chosen them to be an amazing group of people. But on the other hand, the reality of their life was such that they had found themselves in oppression, found themselves in so much failings. Some example they were to the rest of humanity. And it was that conflict is a very real conflict that exists today. What is it, the ridiculous statistic? It's, I don't know exactly, it's something like 50% of marriages end up in divorce or something. What if I was to say something like, oh, but that's not the truth for Christian marriages and for marriages in the church, right? I think we all know very much that as much as we preach a message, we have to reconcile the fact that that merit message isn't always applied within our own lives. And there's a dichotomy that exists between the God who is in charge, I guess. Matt, did you have any other thoughts on chapter 6?
Yeah, I don't know if this is just being arbitrary or not, but does it make sense to phrase it as that God is completely in charge in some sense? By sometimes following that path down, I mean, you've really kind of started us out with the whole problem of pain and free will thing. So thanks for, going easy. But by assuming that he has full control of everything, you kind of end up in that area where then how much of this pain that we see, in the world, in the headlines right now, is attributable to God. I'm hopefully not segging the way to the next chapter, but one thing they talk about in the next chapter is talking about Jesus healing. And one of the things that occurred to me as I was reading that is it's a view of him providing creation to the world, right? And with that, that's what it looks like when he's in charge. Is there is life and there is creation. You look at our world this week where we live right now, and it's decreation, right? It's entropy, and I don't think that we can see God there. And so I heard kind of sin described one way, and that it's a view of two things: man losing sight of how he should look like God, but then also becoming arrogant and where he should be as a creature, and then trying to take too much and become God. And there's a balance in there. And, maybe that chaos and that entropy we see is when man is trying to reach higher than his creatureliness and grasp what aspect of God shouldn't be there for his taking. I don't know.
Yeah, that's go on, John.
But so, I mean, just in light of what's been happening the last 2 weeks, basically, and I'm struck, Matt mentioned free will and a God of love. And we live in America where you have more freedom than anyone else. And you obviously have to draw the line. But why do people have to constantly step over that line and abuse that freedom? And I don't think freedom and free will are exactly the same, but I think they're pretty close. And it's not good enough. Anywhere else in the world, they would literally almost die to have the freedom we have. But yet we have that freedom and we can't be responsible with it, and we're constantly making these mistakes. I don't know. So that's one thought. The other thought is that in a lot of ways, and I like the way N.T. Wright uses the analogy of the storm. In a lot of ways, I think God is in control, just like he was when he was asleep in the boat and the disciples thought they were going to die. And that's how I felt this week.
We don't think he is, based upon.
But we just don't have our sight on him.
Right.
Yeah, and we don't have our sight on him, and we think everything's out of control and we're going to die. And that's kind of how I felt this week. And while Matt was talking, that's kind of what came to mind. It's kind of like, God is still here, and God is still in control. But it's like N.T. Wright says with Matt's quote, or maybe it was James, he has a bigger picture and we're only seeing a small part of that picture, unfortunately. And we got to look for him to know that he's there, otherwise we get distracted by everything else.
Let's take a slight shift into the next part of chapter 6, where N.T. Wright wants to set the tone, or at least the context, as to what goes on in a Jewish mind when they meet Jesus, or when they interact with Jesus. And essentially he points everything back to part of the DNA of a Jewish mind is centered upon the Exodus story. And that Exodus story essentially colors everything about how they react and meet Jesus. And I'm just going to quickly summarize on page 64. He summarizes the Exodus story into a few bullet points. Wicked tyrant, obviously we're talking about Pharaoh. Chosen leader, Moses. Victory of God, obviously when the actual Exodus takes place. Rescue by, well, victory of God when he comes in and he does the plagues and all of that. And then the rescue by sacrifice, the lamb that was put on the doorposts. New vocation, a new way of life as they journey out towards the promised land. The presence of God is that tent that they carried with them. And then finally the promised land and the inherited land. And it's very interesting that the Jews, that he had to highlight that, because I found it very helpful to get out of my own head as to how I perceive Jesus, because I'll be honest and say these aren't my narrative turning points that mean as much to me as the average Jewish person. And I think, you know, I listened to a podcast this week that helped me just open my eyes a bit on the whole abortion debate that's always divided in America. And the commentator said this week something to me, said, we have to understand that there are two sides of the coin, where on one side, there are a group of individuals that believe that at any stage, this thing is a human being. And on the other side, there is a group of people who believe at some point, this thing is not a human being. And I had to force myself into the reality, though I might disagree with things, to accept that those two views exist because of the narratives that exist in their lives, because of the way they perceive. Like, I come to the Bible with so many of my own narratives and perceived ideas, but it was very helpful to be able to be walked through the Exodus narrative. It is no surprise that the Jews have historically been searching for a Messiah, because it is literally part of their DNA in that respect. Even today, those who reject Jesus, they are still searching for that Messiah, because it all goes back to Egypt. It all goes back to their moment. So I thought that was quite helpful. Was there anything else in this chapter that pointed out for people before we move on?
I agree. I thought this theme of Exodus, where it was laid out, was excellent. And I try to take this and apply to my own life and apply to our own, 21st century now, and it perfectly applies.
Mm-hmm.
I can go through the 7 steps and see how it applies to me,
Mm-hmm.
And our story is Exodus. It is. So
yeah, it's definitely at the root of everything. Any other thoughts before we move on to chapter 7?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Dee's saying our story is Exodus, our story is also exile.
Oh, wow.
Kind of juxtaposes that in the next chapter.
Yep.
But I totally agree. I mean, it's our story is we're born in a world of sin and we are lost. But that Christ came to save us from that lostness and to bring us into salvation, which involves redemption and oneness with him. And so, our story every day is Exodus to some degree, exile to some degree, and it all pivots on, in my opinion, your relationship with Christ in so many ways.
Okay, that leads us on to chapter 7.
Didn't mean to steal that from you.
No, that's fine. That leads us on to chapter 7, and then I'll open out chapter 7 with a question, which really is the way that N.T. Wright framed the whole chapter. How did you guys find N.T. Wright framing the narrative of Jesus as a public campaign? What did you think of that?
it makes sense when you, and the previous chapter, how he said that Jesus came to announce the fact that God is in charge now. So that starts off this campaign of starting a new kingdom with a new king.
Mm.
So I mean, it flows. It makes sense. I really, again, I didn't quite think of him that way, just from all the readings and everything else that I've done in my life so far.
Mm.
But
let me take the question further, Dee, not just for you, but for
okay.
everyone else. How did you guys feel? Did you guys feel N.T. Wright was presenting Jesus or reframing Jesus's story as a public political campaign? And how do you feel about that? I thought that he was reframing it as a political campaign.
I could see that. I don't think it was enough that it caught me off guard. I mean, it was fine enough allegory as something we're used to. I wonder though if it was less of a campaign, like political campaign, as much as it was God just being present, right? Like there were certain miracles and healings that he did that you, depending on how you read it, you know, God didn't even, you know, someone touched his robe, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
that wasn't, you could make an argument, maybe that wasn't intentional, maybe it was, but it's just who he was, right? He was present, and that's what happens when he's present. I don't know.
Sure. Let me be clear and say, I don't think that Jesus necessarily acted as much of our politicians do, who are positioning themselves in order to try and boost their ratings. But I think that Jesus was very intentional about positioning himself so that the kingdom can be perceived.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that was definitely throughout that. Anyone else want to weigh in?
I like the way he kind of set the context and then he built on the context. And it's like you say, I mean, he wasn't a politician trying to win approval. He was the king coming and showing us what that looked like. And the unfortunate thing is that conflicted with Rome and what they had for a king. But and then also conflicted with his own people, the Jews, and what they had, you know, for a king, you know, at the time with the priests. And so it's interesting, and it made me think, you know, what do we have today that conflicts with you know, Christ and what he's doing in our lives today?
Right.
And it's hard not to get a little political with that because we have all this stuff going on.
In reading this, I felt like he wasn't proclaiming as to trying to take a power away from someone else, but that this power, this kingdom is like that's his, and he had every right to it. He had every right to come and say that now I'm in charge. Basically, that's how I felt like reading it. I don't think that makes sense.
Well, it makes total sense. I'm just trying to figure out whether he was bold enough to even come. I think he came to make it very clear and remind people, okay, you guys have made your stations of authority, but I'm the one that's over all of you, kind of thing. That's pretty contentious, and I think he knew what he was doing. I think he, like, even when he talks about the narrative and the interactions between him and his cousin John the Baptist, and N.T. Wright kind of breaks that down, the nuances that take place in that story are very intentionally conflict-based. Like, Jesus knows in his response, John the Baptist knows in his response, John the Baptist knows in his disagreement with the Roman leader's choice to marry his nephew, all of that malarkey. Because I almost thought to myself, why is John even getting involved in all of that kind of stuff? But I realized to myself, everything is really centered on Jesus's authority being reaffirmed as fact, not as necessarily something new, but as fact that has always been, that hasn't quite been realized over time. I hope I'm being clear. Anything else that anyone wants to weigh in? James, what stuck out to you in this chapter?
Yeah, when he mentioned some of the way presently when leaders or new political parties come into power, it really did make me bring it to life, bring it to reality. That as John had alluded to, that when a new power or leader comes into play, you're gonna have inevitable conflicts or some disagreements. People who will accept your new leadership style and policies, and those who oppose it. I think it was definitely in the context of what we've been talking about, this perfect storm that the kingdom he was presenting was definitely going to be something that nobody expected. And even just reading back on the synoptic gospels in this new light of seeing him as a proclaiming king, it's just piqued my interest to see how he does it. How does he approach this? How does he N.T. Wright has this, he loves this theme of marrying heaven and earth coming together through the Messiah. He keeps mentioning this, and not just here, but in other of his books. And just to see how that actually manifests, as Matt said, through he proclaims his ministry with healings and celebration. And later in this chapter, I love that it emphasizes forgiveness, healings, celebrations, and forgiveness. I mean, we remember that his first miracle was at the marriage of Cana, where he turns water into wine. That's often an interesting fact, showing that, I mean, why would he choose that of all the miracles he could have chosen? Just to turn water into wine. How inconsequential does that seem? How trivial does that seem? But it represents truly that it's a celebratory, it's just a unbelievable moment in history where heaven and earth are meeting here, and he's proclaiming he's in charge. The kingdom is here now with you, and you're free. The year of the Jubilee. In fact, we remember in Matthew, I remember when I first read Matthew in high school, I was like, why in the world is he listing these boring, genealogies? And he astutely points out that there's like 7 generations from this to this, and then 7 generations this, and then finally, by the time Jesus is, that's like the year of the Jubilee. That's another 7-year time. And N.T. Wright mentions how he starts his inaugural ministry by reading from Isaiah 61 in the temple, where he says, I'm bringing to you the acceptable year of the Lord. That's the Jubilee. So yeah, it's really cool. I never thought of it this way. I never saw this, and it's quite exciting. It reaffirms that, wow, Jesus is not just someone who is just what did it say in one of the chapters? A soul soother. He's not just a soul soother. He's the real deal. This is God actually coming to conquer the devil's territory, and he's got the victory. It's over. It was just a really good reminder of that, and yeah, I'm actually pretty excited just recounting this and reading this.
Any other closing thoughts? It was very inspirational as he wrapped things up towards the nature of forgiveness. But anyone else want to make any closing thoughts on this chapter?
I guess one thing that kind of struck me that he started touching on in the previous chapter was he was talking about the temple and how the Jews viewed the temple was empty in many ways, right? And in that time, the temple is a place where man could call down God, to be on earth, right? It was sometimes even forcing the God and the deity to come to earth. And here's the Jews without that. And one thing that kind of struck me then is it must have been really challenging for them people, even his followers, especially his followers, when you had this man who claimed to be God, but he wasn't in the temple, right? He was out amongst the worst people, right? Pretty well agreed upon, the prostitutes, and the tax collectors, and the murderers, and that's who he was with. And that just must have been such a shock in the idea that, well, God should be in the temple, and the only people who can approach him is the high priest, the one high priest who can go into that innermost sanctuary. But here's this, God that's been set free. I mean, it would have been a challenge, We view it now as something easy and exhibiting the character of God, but how do you view that holy God who's eating with a prostitute? I don't know. That was just something that kind of struck me.
I mean, think of the trouble Sam would get into. Just, lunch
Right.
out in the open, out on the street somewhere in Seattle.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, but he is so confident and for all reason should be.
Yeah.
And he is so right. And that's what I like about it. It's, you want to see what God's like? Look at me.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who I have lunch with, because there's more important things than, what this person does. It's who this person is, and they're a child of God, and I can have lunch with any of my children.
Yeah. I think we sometimes forget how shocking it is. I mean,
I think we do it all the time.
yeah,
It's just constantly have to remind myself. I don't know.
D, any extra thoughts you wanted to add before we wrap things up?
I think the last thought is that I think we as people, we continue to reject God because he's not what we imagine him to be, because he's not meeting our expectations and wishes. And that's really sad. And I hope that we do not get into such place, and if we are, that we can't come out of it. That we don't get stuck there.
Well, I think it's safe to say that N.T. Wright is continuing to take us on the journey to meet the unexpected King. And we are continuing to find ways in which we've seen Jesus, that we probably need to shift our perspective a little bit. We're going to end this episode on these chapters, and our next episode, we will be looking at chapters 8 and 9. Is that correct, guys?
That's correct.
8 and 9. Click the link in the description and you'll be able to get the book, or at least find out where you can get the book, and come join us on the journey. We'd love to be able to hear your thoughts. But for now, this is us saying good evening for this episode of Pages to Progress. Until the next time, may God bless you.